Queen Elizabeth I was hailed as the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the dazzling icon of England's golden age. But there is one shocking, visceral truth her portraits never show, a truth that choked the very air of her court. She could, and did, pollute a room with her presence, her entrance leaving a thick, cloying trail in the air. Beneath the mountain of rustling taffeta, the lead-white makeup, the elaborate wigs, and the perfumed gloves raged a desperate, losing battle to project divine majesty. While her body was a stranger to soap, tonight we will tear the gilt tapestry from the wall to expose the rancid reality of absolute power. So before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you have the stomach for the unvarnished truth. Now, dim the lights. Turn on a fan not for ambience, but to simulate the stale, unmoving air of history. And let's step into the suffocating past. If you fantasize about palace life, the gold leaf, the velvet, the majesty, I need you to stop. Stop and truly imagine this instead. A chamber, glittering in candlelight. Yes, but also a space where the air is a solid, warm, palpable entity. You inhale and are assaulted by something primal. Not roses or potpourri. It is the stench of unwashed humanity, of wool steeped in old sweat, of greasy tallow candles, and an underlying fecal musk that clings to the back of your throat like a disease. Welcome to Whitehall Palace, the dazzling epicenter of Elizabethan power, and arguably the most foul-smelling royal residence in Christendom. Externally, Whitehall was a monument, grand, imposing, a theatre of ambition. But cross the threshold, and the magnificent illusion curdled with every step. The gilded walls wept condensation, the polished floors held the ghosts of spilled wine and worse. People stuffed their sleeves with herbs and swung clove-studded oranges from their belts, not as fashion, but as desperate, crude gas masks. Now the Queen herself was the general in this olfactory war. She mobilised a staggering arsenal not to be clean, but to smell unlike a human being. Her rooms were fortresses of pomanders and incense. Her gowns were lined with desiccated flowers. Her very presence was a marching cloud of ambergris, musk and civet so potent it could make eyes water. She needed it. Because the palace didn't just hum with odour, it screamed it. It was the reek of sweat sealed in velvet, of fur robes matted with decades of body oil, of rancid fat from candles that blackened the ceilings. This was not a failure of protocol. This was the 16th century normal. Bathing was considered an act of medical recklessness, a dangerous invitation for bad air to invade the body. Cleanliness was not a state of hygiene, but a performance of scent. Imagine this, wearing 5 layered intricate gowns in a crowded, sun-heated hall. You dance, you sweat, you feast on spiced meats. That gown is then hung up, brushed, spritzed with vinegar and rose water, and worn again tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. Soap and water for peasants. Your clothing became a diary written in salt, oil and decay. When a courtier bowed, you didn't just smell their perfume, you inhaled the history of their weeks. The tallow candles, cheap and smoky, smouldered with a greasy barnyard stench that seeped into tapestries and souls, whispering a terrible secret. This is the smell of glory. And no one uttered a word. To complain was career suicide, possibly treason. Ambassadors wrote coded horror in private dispatches, but publicly they knelt and breathed through their mouths. Scent was politics. To smell of expensive imported musk was to broadcast power. To smell of mere soap was to announce your irrelevance. Elizabeth weaponized this. Her signature fragrance was a calculated broadcast of sovereignty, designed to enter a room and humble all within it before she even appeared. But even the most potent perfume has a betraying half-life. On a hot day, the alchemy would break down. The layers of scent would melt, revealing glimpses of the biology beneath. The stress sweat, the unguent slathered skin, the unavoidable human animal. Her towering wigs, powdered and perfumed, became sponges for ambient stench. Her glorious, never-washed gowns slowly fermented into museums of their own use. The perfume didn't erase the truth, it married it, creating a new, uniquely regal odour, part goddess, part goat. The court, in thrall, followed her into olfactory overload. Men drenched themselves, women sewed herbs into their corsets. The air grew so thick with competing fragrances that visitors reported fainting spells. But to swoon from the Queen's perfume was to be in the presence of greatness. This was no accident. It was a brutal strategy. In a world where you could smell power before you saw it, Elizabeth ensured her scent was a territorial claim. It was magnificent. It was also, by our standards, utterly revolting. Because let's be brutally clear, that perfume was masking something horrific. No baths, no effective deodorants, rotten teeth. Simply layer upon layer of cloth, powder, sweat, and mortal desperation. You could have scraped the residue from one of her kid gloves and reconstructed the anxieties of an entire decade. Her scent wasn't just a fragrance. It was a biography in decay. And the wardrobe was the smoking gun. Those breathtaking gowns, embroidered with gold and gemstones, were never, ever washed. The very idea was heresy. Water would ruin the fabric, the shape, the fortune spent. Instead, they were brushed, beaten, aired, and perfumed. Sachets of lavender and thyme were stitched into linings, a pathetic, fragrant lie over the truth soaked into the very fibres. The gowns absorbed everything. The nervous heat of a tense negotiation, the sour tang of illness, the cloying sweetness of decaying rosewater. They hung in closets, whispering stories of flesh and fallibility. Beneath it, all was the final, inescapable frontier, the Queen's own body. She bathed perhaps once a month, a cautious ritual of damp cloths and steamy herbal waters, more symbolic than sanitary. Daily maintenance involved linen rags dipped in scented vinegar, dabbed on pulse points, never a full immersion. The philosophy was simple. If you don't smell dirty, you aren't dirty. Her body, sacred and sovereign, was also a prisoner of its own biology, slowly stewing inside its magnificent perfumed cage. Then there was her face, the ultimate illusion. Every morning she was painted with a toxic mask of ceruse, white lead and vinegar, to achieve the deathly pale ideal of nobility. Over this, rouge of vermilion, mercury sulfide, gave the illusion of a life. It was a poison ritual. The lead ate her skin, causing ulcers and requiring thicker layers, trapping the corrupting flesh beneath a flawless, shimmering shell. She was turning herself into a gorgeous talking corpse. Diplomats noted how her makeup melted by evening, revealing the ravaged woman beneath. She was a masterpiece of veneer, cracking a little more each day. But the most intimate betrayal came from within. Elizabeth adored sweets, and her teeth rotted in her head. The pain was excruciating, treated with primitive dentistry and opium pastes. And with the decay came the breath, a putrid, sweet-sour exhalation of infection that no glove or pomander could fully contain. It was the one odor she could never completely master. Courtiers developed a subtle choreography of distance. Larger fans, averted faces, conversations held just a step farther back. It was the open secret everyone pretended not to smell. This is the shocking reality behind the glitter. The Elizabethan court was a breathtaking pageant of power, intellect, and art, staged atop a reeking foundation of human filth. It was a world where people smiled through pearls while their skin itched beneath pounds of unwashed wool, where they pledged allegiance to a goddess whose divine aura was a desperate cocktail of animal musk and slow poison. The truth didn't lurk in shadows. It hung in the air, a thick, perfumed fog of denial. So as you rest in your clean, laundered world, Be grateful for soap, for water, for modern dentistry. And remember, history's most glorious ages didn't always smell like roses. Sometimes they smelled like a queen trying and failing to outrun the mortal stench of her own magnificent decaying body. This response is AI generated for reference only. Use everyday English for masses to understand Queen Elizabeth I was called the Virgin Queen, the great leader of England. But there was one gross thing nobody really talks about. She smelled bad, really bad, and so did her whole palace. We picture kings and queens in sparkling clean castles. The truth is, it was disgusting. It smelled worse than a locker room that hasn't been cleaned in years. Before we get into the gross details, make sure you like this video and subscribe for more honest history. Now let's get into it. If you think you'd want to live in a palace back then, think again. Imagine a beautiful room with candles and fancy curtains. Now imagine the air in that room. It's hot and stuffy. You take a breath and you smell body odour, dirty clothes, smoky candles, and a little bit like a toilet. Welcome to the Queen's house. It looked amazing from the outside, but inside it stank. People back then almost never took baths. They thought water could make you sick. So instead of washing, they just tried to cover up the smell. The Queen had it the worst. She wore giant, heavy dresses every day. She couldn't wash them, they'd be ruined. So she just hung them up and wore them again and again. They got soaked with sweat and then just dried. She tried to hide it. She used tons of perfume, like someone spraying an entire can of air freshener to cover up spoiled milk. She wore perfumed gloves and had bowls of flowers and spices in her rooms. When she walked by, she left a super strong smell of flowers and musk behind her. It was so strong it gave people headaches, but on a hot day the perfume would wear off. The smell of sweat and old clothes would win. You'd get a whiff of the real person under all the fancy stuff. Nobody could say anything. You can't tell the Queen she stinks. So everyone pretended not to notice. They bowed, they smiled, and they tried not to breathe in too deeply. It wasn't just her clothes. Her makeup was toxic. She painted her face white with lead paint, which is poisonous. It made her look pale and fancy, but it also poisoned her skin, making it crack and get sores. The more it hurt her skin, the more makeup she had to use to cover it up. It was a terrible cycle. And her teeth? Rotten. She loved sugary foods and had no real dentists. Her breath was probably awful. She'd chew on herbs to try to make it better, but you can imagine it didn't really work, so the next time you see a painting of this powerful, perfect queen, remember the truth. Her world was a place of amazing art and power, but it was also filthy, smelly, and kind of gross. She lived in a beautiful castle that probably smelled like a mix of strong perfume, old sweat, and bad breath. Be thankful for soap, showers, and toothpaste. Being royal back then wasn't all it's cracked up to be. It was a dirty, smelly job. Still, she kept up the act. In paintings, her lips were tight and closed, looking perfect. Poets wrote about her beautiful smile and sweet breath. But in private, it was a different story. Her teeth were getting worse. Some fell out on their own. Others had to be pulled. Chewing became hard. She started avoiding tough foods, eating only soft stuff like soups and stewed fruit. Even her favourite foods lost their appeal. Rumours started. People whispered that she skipped public meals, left banquets early and spent hours alone rinsing her mouth with rose water. But you'd never read that in the history books. The Queen had to be strong. She couldn't be brought down by a toothache. So everyone stayed quiet. In her private rooms, she dealt with the pain, the bleeding, the fear of the next meal, and the court kept a polite distance, careful never to mention what they all knew. If the Queen's breath was bad, the whole perfect image would crack, and nobody wanted to live in a world where the Virgin Queen had bad breath. In a way, it was human. They weren't really lying. They were protecting something bigger than one person. They were protecting a symbol that had gotten England through wars and plagues. If that meant ignoring a bad smell, then so be it. But history has a way of sniffing out the truth. You can see it in old letters, doctor's notes, and the way she began to keep her lips pressed together, even when she laughed, even when she was in pain. Behind the makeup and the perfumed gloves was a mouth suffering in silence, and behind, that silence was a queen who ruled through pain no one dared to name. Somewhere in the palace, behind fancy doors and velvet curtains, there was a special chair. It didn't look like much, just plain wood with a worn cushion. But if you lifted the seat, you'd see the truth. This wasn't a throne. This was the Queen's toilet. It was built for dignity and privacy. Under the cushion was a hole, and under that was a chamber pot, probably brass, if it had been cleaned recently. Even a queen, covered in lace and perfume, still had to go to the bathroom. She didn't do it alone. Attendants helped, bringing basins, cloths, and fresh herbs. They poured scented vinegar into bowls and kept their eyes down. They didn't speak unless spoken to. This wasn't just a bodily function. It was a ceremony. There was no plumbing in the palace, nothing flushed. Everything had to be carried away by hand by a servant whose job was to remove the royal waste quietly and discreetly. The room was closed off with heavy curtains and small windows. Air didn't move much, so smells stuck around. They tried to cover it up, hanging bags of lavender, leaving out bowls of dried herbs and orange peels in vinegar. Sometimes they'd walk through with smoking incense, but it never lasted long. The room always smelled like what it was. The Queen would rinse her hands with rosewater afterward, not really washing, just dabbing and freshening up. It was the same basin dozens of others had used. Nobody truly washed back then. They just made themselves smell clean. It's easy to imagine a palace being spotless, but underneath, the truth was always there. The Queen's toilet wasn't special. Every noble had one. Servants knew which hallways to avoid. Waste was carried out daily, quietly, so no one had to think about it. The chair itself was wiped down with vinegar and herbs, but the pot beneath told the real story. It held her bad days, her stress, her stomach troubles. No one talked about it. They'd say she was retiring for comfort. The word toilet wasn't even used. For Elizabeth, it was the only room where no one expected her to speak. Still, she kept her grace. Even there, her posture was perfect. If she winced, her maids looked away. Dignity had to be protected at all times, but the smell couldn't be hidden. Some days it leaked into the hall. Nobody mentioned it. They'd open a window, light another candle, put on more perfume and carry on. It became part of the palace, a mix of bodies, waste, vinegar, lavender and smoke. It was human, deeply human, and no matter how much they perfumed it, it never really went away. Elizabeth knew this. She wasn't naive, but she understood the need to pretend. So the chair stayed hidden, the smell was managed, and she kept her gaze steady. Because if a queen could stand strong through sickness, she could certainly sit in silence and make the world believe she didn't need to go at all. After using the toilet, the ritual wasn't over. The Queen would hold out her hands and someone would bring a basin of rosewater or vinegar, warmed and lightly scented. She didn't scrub with soap, just rinsed and dabbed her fingers. It wasn't about getting clean, it was about keeping up appearances. This was more about etiquette than hygiene. Most people at court didn't wash their hands unless they got visibly dirty. They'd wipe their fingers on their sleeves or the tablecloth, then keep eating, drinking and dancing. Servants might bring scented cloths to the nobles after a feast, just a quick wipe over the fingers. The rich didn't wash, they freshened. A courtier might rub lemon peel on his hands or dab vinegar on his gloves, but the gloves themselves were rarely taken off and the hands inside weren't clean. In dances, hands touched, sweat passed from person to person, perfumes mixed with skin, but nobody stopped to wash. They were too busy smiling and pretending. There were little signs of refinement, offering a gloved hand to be kissed, holding a perfumed cloth to your nose, dipping your fingertips in herbs before a meal. These replaced soap, and in a place like Whitehall Palace, that was enough. But invisibly, germs travelled fast. A touch, a cough, a borrowed fan. Illness spread easily. Fevers and sore throats passed through the court like gossip. And still, washing wasn't common. The rosewater basin was mostly for the Queen. Elizabeth was more careful than most. She knew appearances mattered. Clean hands helped her seem untouchable. But even her habits were for show. Her hands were rinsed, her face dabbed, her wrists perfumed. But the skin under her rings never saw daylight. And her gloves, when removed, told their own story. Some whispered she even slept in special herb-lined gloves to soothe her skin and mask odours overnight. True or not, it fit the pattern. Cleanliness was a performance, a layer, a scent, a glove between the truth and the touch. Each morning, the cycle started again. The basin was filled, the vinegar stirred. She'd dip her fingers, lift them, and let the scent rise like incense. A queen's version of washing, half ritual, half mask. Meanwhile, the rest of the court had ink, soot, and food stains on their hands. They reached into bowls, fixed their jewels, and adjusted their clothes. And nobody minded because the performance was never about being clean. It was about what people could pretend not to see. If you walk through Whitehall half asleep, you might think it was spotless. If you judge by perfume, you'd think you were among angels. But if you opened your eyes and took a deep breath, the truth settled in. Behind every rose petal was a stain. Behind every glove was grime. Behind every hand was the unwashed echo of someone else's day. And just like that, we moved from hands to clothes. Because what touched those hands most was sleeves, gowns that brushed against arms, cuffs that were adjusted, scarves passed from one perfumed body to another. And those gowns, they were almost never washed. They hung like trophies, heavy with embroidery, trimmed with fur, stiff with ornate collars. From far away they looked heavenly. Up close, they smelled like people. People who sweated through long ceremonies, danced in hot rooms, and wore wigs in candle heat. These weren't fresh laundry. They were costumes of survival, scented, but never cleaned. Every morning, maids turned the gowns inside out, shook out the dust, and hung them by a cracked window. But not for long, since sunlight could fade the colours. There was no washing, no soap. Water was seen as the enemy. It could stain or ruin the fabric. Instead, they used stiff brushes to sweep the surface, and tucked perfume sachets into every fold. Lavender, rose petals, cloves. The goal wasn't to make them smell nice, but to cover up the unavoidable. Some gowns hadn't been worn in months, but still carried memories. A spot of rouge from the Queen's cheek, a wine stain on the cuff, the scent of long meetings and late-night rituals. Nobody dared wash any of it away. These weren't just clothes. They were living records. If a stain was too visible, they'd stitch a flower over it. If a smell was too strong, they'd store the gown for a season. But they never called anything dirty. That word was too ordinary for royalty. Elizabeth had hundreds of gowns, but she wore her favourites again and again, not because they were fresh, but because they worked. A stiff hem helped her posture. A layered bodice made her look strong. A brushed velvet looked new from across the throne room, even if it smelled like last summer up close. Even the underwear, the linen shifts worn, closest to her skin, were only washed when absolutely necessary. Washing was for servants and farmers, not queens. The air in the wardrobe room smelled like dry herbs, old sweat, rose oil and camphor. It was the smell of effort, layered day after day until it felt normal. One foreign envoy once said England's court smelled like a church on fire. Nobody corrected him. It was resinous, smoky, holy, and flammable. Some attendants worried all the perfume oils rubbed into the fabric could catch fire if someone stood too close to a hearth. There were small accidents, a sleeve smouldering near a candle, a sash brushing a lantern. But nobody talked about it. Image came before safety. Always. In this court, being clean wasn't the same as looking clean. A spotless gown was suspicious. It meant it hadn't yet been worn by the Queen, hadn't absorbed her presence, hadn't played its part in the theatre of power. Every garment told a story, not of freshness, but of continuity, ritual, and scent as memory, power, and camouflage. Because no one could smell like lavender and myrrh without a reason. It took planning, it took discipline, it took knowing that even dirt could be shaped into something royal. And above all these gowns, above the layers of fabric and fragrance, was something even more carefully crafted. Hair that wasn't hers. The Queen's wigs sat on shelves in her private room, dozens of them, styled in stiff curls and towering shapes. They didn't smell like hair. They smelled like cinnamon, violet powder, burnt herbs, and old smoke. And that was on purpose. Elizabeth didn't wear wigs to trick anyone. Everyone knew her real hair was thinning and going grey. The wigs were for show. Each was a sculpted piece, stiff with wax and sprinkled with perfume powder, so heavily scented you could smell her coming down the hall. But they were never cleaned. They were too delicate for water, too stiff for combs. Whatever touched them stayed. Face powder, rouge, and on hot days, sweat from her scalp mixing with the oils. The result was a smell that was sweet, spicy, slightly sour, and unmistakably royal. Wig attendants tried their best, dusting them with perfume starch, dabbing on vinegar, adding more lavender. But you can't fix a wig that's never been washed. In the summer, with no fresh air, those scents got strong. When the Queen leaned in to whisper, courtiers might flinch slightly, not from fear, but from the wave of smell coming from her hairline. It wasn't exactly bad, just overwhelming. Over time, each wig developed its own personality. One smelled like cloves and pepper, another like dried roses. One picked up a mildew scent after being stored in a damp room and was nicknamed the Widowmaker, though nobody said it out loud when she wore it. Washing them was unthinkable. They were part of the royal ritual, so they were aired by windows, brushed gently, and stored in mint-lined boxes. Whether it helped or not didn't matter. The wigs weren't just hair, they were crowns in disguise. Heavy, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. Some were decorated with pearls and feathers, all stiff with product. Rumours said she sometimes slept sitting up to keep them perfect, or that her maids repinned them while she dozed. True or not, it fit the image. Her scent, from her hair, clothes, gloves and skin, was a signal. It told people when she entered the room. It told foreigners they were in the presence of power. It told servants to keep their distance. Nobody could copy it exactly. Others tried powdering their hair with similar scents, but they didn't have the layers, the years, the weight of wigs worn like armour. To stand near her was to be part of a ceremony you could smell. You saw the bright wig, the shimmering powder, the stiff lace, and you breathed in the history, the effort, the stubborn refusal to be ordinary. And underneath it all was a human, head, tired, aging, and sweating through the act of being divine. But the court didn't want a human. They wanted a monument. So she gave them one wig at a time. By the time someone entered Elizabeth's court, they were walking into a world built on scent. The hallways didn't just look rich, they smelled intentional. Not like dirt, but like carefully layered perfume pressed into every thread, powdered onto every wig, rubbed into every glove. Politics here began with smell. If a noblewoman wore violet oil, she was signalling class. If a courtier smelled of musk or civet, it meant he had money, or knew someone who did. Poorer attendants smelled of old wool and cheap herbs, and they weren't allowed to stay long. In this world, smell was status. Or rather, the absence of bad smell was. The Queen was the master of this. She didn't just want to look untouchable, she wanted to smell untouchable. And she did. Whether standing at the top of the stairs or walking through a room, her scent arrived first. People turned not because they heard her, but because they caught her smell. Rose oil mixed with something dark, foreign and expensive. That scent was her shield, her brand, her announcement. It was designed to overwhelm, to be remembered. Foreign visitors wrote about the English court's atmosphere. They called it scented like a temple, a market, or a funeral in summer. Those weren't compliments, but they proved the Queen's presence was felt. In a time when messages could be forged, smell was strangely reliable. If you were important, you smelled like it. Not just pleasant, but rich, complicated and designed. Elizabeth changed her perfumes like strategy. Spices during tense talks, flowers when meeting suitors, bitter herbs when she feared betrayal. People noticed. Diplomats tried to copy her to flatter her. Some succeeded. Others overdid it and smelled like a spice shop on fire. Perfume was a delicate game. One wrong move and you smelled desperate. At banquets, it became a fragrance war. The Queen's tablecloths were soaked in rosewater, her silver wiped with orange oil, her gloves scented with ambergris. The event was less about eating and more about breath control. Those who couldn't handle it coughed into their napkins and hoped nobody saw. This wasn't just excess, it was control. If Elizabeth's scent filled a room, the room was hers. If you could sense her power through smell before she even spoke, her rule was complete. Even painters tried to capture it, giving her powdered skin, perfumed gloves, a kind of invisible glow. People at the time knew. Being near the Queen meant breathing in her authority. The court adjusted. Meetings were held after bathing times. Visitors were told to wear scent, but not too much. Maids walked behind her with herbs to adjust the air. Council debates happened in rooms thick with incense. It's easy now to laugh, to think a queen could hold a kingdom, together with perfume, but in her world it worked. Scent was loyalty. Scent was obedience. Scent was fear and command, all rolled into one invisible veil. In a time before microphones, before photos, before headlines, the Queen's smell was her first impression and her lasting legacy. Nobody forgot it, not even those who tried. The court wasn't just a place of beauty and power, it was a battlefield of scent. And at the very top stood a woman who knew that sometimes the best way to silence a room was to overwhelm it, without saying a word. There was a moment, right after entering the Great Hall, when the air seemed to stop moving. It felt thick and warm, like it had been breathed too many times. Then the smells hit you, all at once. Roses, musk, cloves, wine, old fabric, incense, and something darker, sour, and sweet together. This wasn't an accident. It was court life. Every person added to the mix. A duke might smell of rosewater and brandy. A lady might smell of violets and yesterday's garlic. Some smelled like sandalwood, others like mildew or damp shoes. Nobody pointed it out. It was the background noise of the nose, a silent agreement to pretend everything smelled fine. This blend became an identity. Foreign ambassadors called it the warm atmosphere or the richness of presence. But everyone knew what they meant. You couldn't stand in Elizabeth's court without breathing in decades of smell soaked into the wood, the velvet, the people. Fireplaces helped a little, the smell of burning wood cutting through briefly. But heat often made it worse, lifting old smells out of carpets and cushions. Servants tried to manage it, hanging herbs in corners, stuffing mint behind tapestries, waving pots of smoking resin through the halls. But it was like trying to perfume a battlefield. The smell always won. Yet, strangely, nobody seemed offended. This was just how it was. The court's collective smell was proof you were there, part of the machine. And like any machine, it ran hot, loud, and not very clean. People learned to adapt, to hold their breath at the right moment, to turn their head politely during a whisper, to ignore the man who smelled of damp wool and sour wine. Clothes added to it. Layers of unwashed cloaks, reused gloves, sweaty undergarments powdered and worn again. You could smell a person's rank, their breakfast, their nerves, just by walking past them. Sometimes there were surprises, a sharp smell of decay, a reminder that underneath the perfume and powder, everyone was still human. Once, a visiting noble fainted in a side room, not from emotion, but from a wave of smell too strong to handle. Nobody laughed. They understood. It could happen to anyone. Even the Queen wasn't completely shielded. Courtiers crowded close, their smells colliding around her. One advisor, it was said, had a personal odour so strong it lingered for an hour after he left. He was eventually given outdoor duties. In this world, smell was memory. You didn't just remember a conversation, you remembered how it smelled. The cinnamon on a diplomat's breath, the decay of an old lord's robe, the citrus trailing a rising star. Those lingered longer than words, and yet, for all the stink, nobody tried to change it. Cleanliness wasn't the goal, survival was, image was, and in the hierarchy of needs, the comfort of your nose ranked far below the comfort of your crown. So the court just kept going. They powdered, perfumed, layered, and faked it. They took shallow breaths and smiled big smiles because the smells weren't a mistake. They were the whole point. They were a living map of who had power, who had money, and who got to stand closest to the Queen. As we get deeper into daily life back then, that truth stays the same. Behind the painted faces and fancy dresses, behind the politics and the shows, was one simple, inescapable fact. Everyone smelled, and everyone pretended they didn't. There's something very stage-like about how Queen Elizabeth showed herself to the world. It wasn't just about power. It was about keeping up an image so carefully built, so perfectly protected, that even the dirt underneath had to look like glitter. She wasn't just a woman. She was a symbol, a carefully powdered ghost in a dress that whispered legends. People didn't bow to a person. They bowed to an idea wrapped in silk, and that idea had to smell good, even if it was sitting on top of a week's-old sweat. Every morning her team didn't just dress her, they built her. First came the skin. It had to look pale, smooth, and perfect, not because she liked it, but because pale skin meant you were virtuous and noble. You didn't work outside in the sun. So they painted her face with a thick paste made of white lead and vinegar. Over time, it cracked, but nobody said a word. From far away, it looked like perfect porcelain. Up close, it was a crust of poison, a mask that got heavier every year. Then came the blush. Not a soft pink, but a bright red made from mercury. It gave her cheeks a glow, but it slowly poisoned her nerves. It could cause shaking, sleeplessness, and who knows what else. But nobody whispered about that. The Queen was never tired. She was thoughtful. She wasn't sick. She was contemplative. Her eyebrows, thin and shaped, were often darkened with soot. In paintings, they looked elegant. In person, maybe a little strange. But who would dare say so? She could have walked in with mud on her face and her court would have called it the latest fashion. That's the thing about power. It doesn't have to be pretty. It just has to be unquestioned. What really sold the illusion, though, was the lighting. Nobody ever saw Elizabeth in bright daylight. Meetings happened in rooms lit by candles or dim, filtered light. Soft shadows hid the cracks in her makeup. The flickering glow made her skin shimmer and distracted from the dry, flaking patches. Even mirrors were controlled. There were few in her private rooms, and the ones she had were placed in soft, forgiving light. She had to believe the illusion too. Because if the image cracked, even a little, everything could fall apart. And underneath it all was a woman getting older. Her teeth were rotting. Her skin was scarred from smallpox. Her famous red hair had thinned so much she needed wigs, but the story couldn't allow for weakness. So she became something else. A statue that could move. A walking, scented painting. It's easy to feel sorry for her, and maybe we should. But it's also important to see that she was in charge of the charade. She demanded it. She enforced it. Her ladies-in-waiting were told never to speak of what they saw. Courtiers knew to give compliments, not comments. The whole court became the supporting cast in a never-ending play called The Virgin Queen. This wasn't about being clean like we think of it today. This was about meaning. The smell of lavender didn't mean she was fresh. It meant she was untouchable. The smoothness of her gown didn't mean comfort. It meant purity. Even when she was sick, she had to look invincible. The illusion was stronger than the body. The story was more important than the truth. No wonder historians today have trouble finding the real Elizabeth. Was she confident, or just trapped by expectations? Was she proud or imprisoned by the role she made? Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe she was just too deep into the act to ever stop. Even her portraits lied. Artists were told to make her look better. Smoother skin, brighter eyes, a longer neck. The Queen had to approve each painting. If it showed too much humanity, it was thrown out. Only the divine could remain. Only the flawless. Imagine being so powerful that even your pictures had to lie for you. And yet, behind closed doors, she must have felt the weight of it all. The hours sitting still while paint dried on her face. The stiffness of her heavy gowns. The endless layers that felt more like armour than clothing. She kept going not just because she wanted to, but because she had to. In a world where a woman's power was always doubted, performing perfection was a necessity. If she slipped, even for a second, they might attack. So she smiled. She stood tall. She wore white. She glowed like a pearl. Even as her body begged for rest. It's ironic, really. What we admire now, her strength, her image, her mystery, was built on powder, perfume, sweat hidden under silk, and routines so exhausting they'd make a modern celebrity quit. Yet we remember the icon, not the effort. The scent, not the sweat. Maybe that's what she wanted. To be remembered as more than a person. To be remembered as a presence. A myth. Something clean, controlled, and forever untouched. But under all that powder, Elizabeth was still human. And if her skin could talk, it would tell a very different story. People back then didn't fear germs. They didn't even know germs existed. What they did fear was bad smells. They believed disease came from foul air, invisible clouds of stink floating through cities and palaces. This was called the miasma theory. If the air smelled bad, it was dangerous. If it smelled good, it was safe. Simple, wrong, but comforting. In a court obsessed with looks, this idea took over. Bad smells meant corruption, sin, sickness. Good smells meant purity, control, and health. This let people live with filth as long as they could cover it up with something sweet. That's where the perfume came in. The stronger the smell, the more protected you thought you were. Elizabeth wasn't going to risk smelling like the London gutters. Her court was drowned in perfumes, oils, herbs, and scented candles. They didn't think this made them clean. They thought it kept sickness away. It was like a magical charm. Walls were hung with dried lavender. Floors were sprinkled with rose water. Gloves were soaked in musk. The result wasn't cleanliness. It was confusion. A room might smell like a garden, but the walls were mouldy and the corners were dirty. Still, they trusted their noses. Smell was their warning system. When Elizabeth walked by, trailing jasmine and spice, people felt they were in the presence of royalty and safety. The truth was less pretty. Under the perfume, her world was just as dirty as a poor person's home. The drains were bad, the water was dirty, and rats lived in the palace. But as long as the air didn't smell like death, people told themselves everything was fine. The irony is painful. They worked so hard to smell nice while ignoring real problems. They thought if something didn't stink, it couldn't hurt them. It was denial in a fancy bottle. And to be fair, it wasn't all their fault. They didn't have microscopes. They didn't know about germs. They didn't know that diseases like cholera don't come with a smell. So they fought invisible threats with what they could see. Herbal smoke in hallways, orange peels in windows, bags of roses tied to their wrists. These weren't just habits. They were hopes. Desperate, sweet-smelling hopes that the world made sense. Even Elizabeth, with all her education and doctors, believed this. She clung to her scented gloves and rosewater rinses as if they could keep her from getting sick. And in a way they did. Not medically, but socially. The Queen smelled better than peasants, so she must be healthier. Smell became status. You could guess a person's rank by their scent. Musk for the powerful, spices for the connected, sweat and smoke for the poor. Cleanliness was never about health. It was about hierarchy. In a world where diseases had no names and sickness was seen as God's punishment, scent gave people a feeling of control. It let them believe they could fight back. One more handful of mint in your pillow. One more splash of lavender on your collar. These were the shields they put up every morning. Not because they worked, but because they were all they had. Looking back, it's easy to laugh at their ignorance. But are we so different? We still connect cleanliness with smell. Fresh linen, lemon cleaner, minty breath. We buy candles and air fresheners that promise calm. We cover up smells with nicer ones just like they did. The only difference is we know what we're hiding they didn't have. That luxury. Diseases spread anyway. People died anyway. But at least they died believing they had tried. There's something heartbreakingly human in that. Trusting your nose even when your eyes see the truth. Pouring your fear into a bottle of rose oil and hoping it's enough. So the palace stayed fragrant. It shimmered with the illusion of purity. Elizabeth stayed the scented queen, floating above the stink of her own crumbling home. The air smelled like cloves and chamomile while the drains gurgled with things nobody wanted to name. It was a world dressed in perfume and denial. And maybe that's why it lasted, because it smelled better than the truth. She may have ruled with a steady hand, but Elizabeth's body told a different story. By the time her image was legendary, white-faced, red-haired, untouched by time, her teeth were rotting, her bones ached, and fevers came and went like unwanted guests. But in a court built on appearances, pain had no place, so she hid it. So, not just from the public, but from her advisors, her court, and maybe even herself. Every morning she put on the armour of a queen, thick lead makeup, stiff embroidered gowns, and a practised smile that said her presence was stronger than her pulse. Toothaches were ignored. Exhaustion was hidden under powdered cheeks. She stood through ceremonies with a clenched jaw and eyes that gave nothing away. Even with a fever, she'd appear dressed in white, looking like a ghost of strength. But the body has limits. When she couldn't stand another meeting, she'd retreat to her private rooms. The curtains would close. Outside, rumours started. She's resting. She has a chill. She's tired. Anything but the truth. The truth was too human. Inside, she was just a patient. She winced through sleepless nights with tooth pain. She sweated through sheets soaked in rosewater. When it got too bad, she reached for what little help existed. Cloves to bite on, wine mixed with opium, herbs pressed. To her temples, these were her comforts. Primitive, fragrant, and a little magical. Not because they worked well, but because they helped her believe they might. Doctors back then were confident but not competent. They talked about humours and balances, not bacteria. Her own doctor prescribed oils, powders, and silence. He knew the best medicine was for her not to be seen this way. Outside her room, the story went on. The Queen is radiant. The Queen is strong. The Queen is eternal. Inside, she lay in bed, pressing clove oil to her gums, trying not to cry. Because crying wasn't queenly. Pain wasn't queenly. And showing weakness could unravel everything she'd built. She wasn't just a woman. She was England. But no illusion lasts forever. Over time, people saw cracks. Her voice trembled, her posture slouched, her appearances got shorter. Still, nobody dared say it out loud. To admit the Queen was suffering was to remind everyone of their own mortality, and that wouldn't do. Even in pain, Elizabeth stayed committed to the show. Her gowns got heavier, her jewels got bigger, her wigs got taller. It was as if she thought more layers could hold her together. The truth was simpler and sadder. She was tired. Tired from age, from sickness, and from the endless need to pretend. In private, she held on to the scents that had been with her all her life. Lavender, sage, the bitter taste of poppy syrup. They weren't just comforts. They were constants in a world falling apart. Some say she fought death with pride. Others say she refused to admit defeat. Maybe she just didn't know how to stop being queen. The crown had become her skin. Taking it off meant showing what was underneath. A tired, hurting woman who'd run out of strength but showed up anyway because the role demanded it. By the end, even her doctors could only watch. Opioids dulled her senses, but the infection in her mouth never left. Her nights were restless. She stopped trusting mirrors. Instead, she surrounded herself with symbols. Paintings, music, candles, fragrance, anything that reminded her of who she'd been. Looking back, it feels both tragic and predictable. Of course she hid it. Of course she denied it. In her world, vulnerability wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. A queen who limped could be replaced. A queen who winced invited questions. So she smiled through rotten teeth and stood through nausea. And when it was too much, she vanished behind scented curtains and let the legend take over. In the end, her greatest act wasn't in how she ruled or fought. It was in how she managed to be so deeply human while convincing the world she wasn't. All it took was a little perfume, a little poppy, and a whole lot of pretending. Of all the things Elizabeth gave up for her crown, maybe the most painful was the right to be sick. Her kingdom could handle storms and rebellions, but a faltering queen was unthinkable. Sickness wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a threat to power, a stain on the illusion. So she refused to show it. Her health failed quietly behind closed doors, while she kept gliding through ceremonies in satin and powder, smiling through the ache. Her image mattered more than her comfort. When her legs grew weak, she wore heels instead of slippers. When her jaw throbbed, she chose to laugh. When her heart fluttered, she stood straighter and pretended the ground was steady. She did not limp, she did not lean. If she stumbled, it was the floor's fault, never hers. White gowns became her signature, not for comfort, but because they made her look beyond human. They shimmered in candlelight and whispered of invincibility. Nobody wanted to imagine their queen curled up in bed in pain. They wanted a statue, a myth brought to life, and Elizabeth gave it to them every single day. The court played along. They bowed lower when she seemed tired. They laughed louder when her voice cracked. Nobody mentioned the sweat on her forehead or the shake in her hands. Keeping the illusion alive was a team effort. Behind the scenes, the work of hiding was exhausting. Her maids didn't just dress her, they disguised her. Corsets were tightened to force good posture. Padding was sewn into gowns to hide frailty. Makeup covered more than it beautified. Every appearance was a performance. The dressing room was backstage. The palace hallways were her stage. All of England was her audience. Even when she could barely lift her arm to wave, she still waved. Even when her teeth hurt too much to chew, she sat at feasts and picked at her food. There was a script, and she knew every line. Sometimes she sat for portraits during her worst moments. Artists were told to paint her youth, not her truth. They smoothed wrinkles, brightened eyes, erased veins. The result was a woman who no longer existed in the mirror, but she lived on in paint, frozen, untouched. These portraits became propaganda for strength, holding up what her body no longer could. And still she kept going. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was fear, or maybe she just didn't know how to be anything else. To step away, to rest, to admit weakness felt like inviting chaos. She'd been queen so long that her presence was stability. If she faltered, what would happen? So she bore it. The back pain, the headaches, the bone-deep tiredness. She bore it with grace, stubbornness, and an incredible ability to act like everything was fine, even for an audience of just a few courtiers in a cold hall. There was something tragic in this unspoken deal. A court that couldn't tell the truth, a queen who couldn't show it, and a country that preferred the lie to reality. It wasn't that people didn't care about her health, they just didn't want to see it. They'd been taught she was permanent. To admit she was mortal was to break the very idea of Elizabeth. In private, some whispered. Advisors exchanged looks when she stumbled. Maids cried quietly when they changed sweat-soaked sheets. But none of it reached the surface. None of it touched the public stage. Elizabeth remained untouched. From a distance, her court looked like a celebration. Up close, it was a tightrope walk. Everyone avoided the cracks. The throne stood tall, but the floor beneath it creaked. And the Queen, magnificent as ever, stood right in the middle, smiling, nodding, ruling, while pretending not to feel it shake. In a way, this was her final victory. Not the war she won, but this. The sheer will to keep standing when her body begged to sit. The courage to keep performing when the curtain should have closed. The dignity to make sure that when she finally left the stage, it would be to applause, not pity. They say imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. In Elizabeth's court, it was more like a survival guide. If the Queen wore a certain scent, her courtiers did too. If she paused a certain way when speaking, half the council copied her within a week. They didn't just do it to flatter her, they did it to stay in favour, to stay relevant, and to keep their heads firmly on their shoulders. Her habits trickled down through the palace like perfume through silk. Fancy gowns, oil-soaked gloves, speech patterns arranged like a dinner table. Her favourites led the way, and soon everyone followed, whether they wanted to or not. There was no official rule that said, "Talk like the Queen," but everyone understood. Her way of speaking became the court language, her posture became the proper etiquette, and her scent became the very air they breathed. It started small, a tilt of the head, a wave of the hand, a thoughtful pause. Then came the gloves. Not just any gloves, but ones soaked in rose oil and stored with lavender. Soon, walking into the council chamber felt like walking into a perfume shop. The air was thick with flowers, spices, and something musky underneath. Older men dabbed a little scent on their cuffs, hoping it was enough. Younger ones went overboard. One young lord, desperate to impress at a banquet, used so much musk and ambergris that he nearly fainted. His jacket reeked for days, making servants gag. Rumour even said his sleeve once brushed a candle and caught fire. All that oil and powder made him burn like a torch. He survived with singed pride and a nickname that stuck forever. Nobody told him to use less perfume. The lesson wasn't don't smell so strong. It was be more careful around candles. To be fair, the Queen created this world. She made fragrance a sign of taste, rank and refinement. It was never just about smelling nice. It was a message. I am above filth. I do not decay. I glow. I sparkle. I smell of roses, not sweat. And if the Queen lived that way, her court had to keep up. They copied her in other ways too. Her walk, her phrases, her habit of tapping a ringed finger when bored. Some practised her careful diplomacy, pausing just long enough to seem clever. Others learned to look disinterested while listening closely, a skill she'd mastered after years of dealing with liars and flatterers. In meetings, people echoed her turns of phrase, sometimes accidentally, sometimes so obviously it was hard not to smile. A few took it too far. One lord showed up in a white satin outfit so powdered he looked like a walking pastry. Another tried to copy her high rough collar and couldn't turn his head without poking someone's eye out. But this was seen as loyalty, not mockery. Looking silly was a small price for royal favour. Even their laughter changed. Elizabeth had a controlled, melodic chuckle that never shook her shoulders. Soon, the council room was full of polite, refined chuckles. Belly laughs were considered rude. The effect was surreal, a room full of grown men and women all subtly pretending to be one woman. Their own personalities gently put aside, not out of fear, but out of devotion to the strange play they were all in. To belong, you had to blend in. To stand out, you had to imitate her perfectly. So the court became a hall of mirrors, every reflection a little warped, but clearly modelled after the same image. The palace grew quieter in its weirdness. The louder the scents, the softer the voices, the fancier the clothes, the more controlled the movements. It was like they were all acting inside a glass box, pretending not to sweat, not to age, not to think about the rot under the floor or the ache in their knees. The Queen had taught them well. Decay wasn't to be acknowledged. It was to be perfumed and ignored. There was something funny and sad about the whole act. Powerful nobles in silk and perfume tiptoeing through history, hoping to stay in character. One wrong smell, one wrong move, and you could find yourself on the outside. Not banished, just forgotten under the powder and perfume of someone else's shadow. It worked for a while. The illusion held. The Queen was the sun, and her court spun around her, golden, sweet-smelling, and a little bit flammable. But behind the scents and smiles was a quiet truth no rose oil could cover. They were all afraid. Afraid of losing status, of getting old, of being seen for what they really were. Just people. Sweaty, flawed, aging people. And that, more than anything, kept them reaching for the perfume. For all her attention to detail, there was one thing Queen Elizabeth famously ignored. Plumbing. The Queen, so careful about her looks and the smells of her court, somehow looked the other way when it came to toilets and drains. Pipes and sewage were for plumbers and peasants, not queens. Elizabeth would much rather pay for another portrait of herself in silk than fund a new drainage system under Whitehall Palace. While artists painted her in glowing white gowns, the hallways below her feet were slowly stewing. A mix of waste, kitchen slop and dead rats crept through old, cracked pipes, but the Queen's focus was above ground. Tapestries, jewels, parties, those were what mattered, not the faint smell of rot rising through the floor. It's not that nobody noticed. Courtiers would delicately mention earthy smells near certain stairwells. A visiting ambassador once called the palace sumptuous, though with a certain vigour in the air. But Elizabeth treated the problem like a draft. She closed a window and pretended it was gone. The money was there. England wasn't poor. But the Queen had a different kind of legacy in mind. She wanted the court to shine with luxury, not stink of ditch digging and pipe laying. So funds went to banquets, pageants, and Italian fabric while the smell under the palace climbed the stairs like an unwelcome guest. To be fair, she tried to mask it her way. More herbs, more incense, more bowls of dried flowers in every corner. Lavender bundles hung from silk ribbons on the curtains. She fought the stench, with perfume, not pipes. Because in her world, the solution wasn't to fix the problem. It was to make sure nobody could smell it. Smoke from burning juniper was blown through the halls before important meetings. It was like trying to fix a broken wall by hanging a bigger picture over it. You couldn't see the damage anymore, but you could still smell it. Some rooms were worse than others. The hallway near the kitchen sometimes smelled like sulphur. On warm days, the bathroom near the chapel was so bad even the priests cut their prayers short. Servants scattered rosemary on the floors and crushed mint under their feet as they walked, hoping the smell would help. It barely did. But in the grand show of court life, the bad smell just became part of the background, like the smell of candle smoke or damp stone. What's surprising is how few people complained. Maybe they were too scared. Or maybe, when you live with a bad smell long enough, you just stop noticing it. When everything is covered in perfume and fancy manners, even sewage becomes part of the ceremony. Nobles held their perfumed handkerchiefs closer, to their noses. Servants learned which corners to avoid, and the queen, wrapped in her cloud of musk and orange blossom, probably couldn't smell it at all. There's something almost poetic about it. A palace built on gold and glitter, sitting right on top of bubbling waste. No matter how stiff the collars or how thick the face powder, real life had a way of reminding you it was there. Elizabeth's choice to ignore the plumbing makes sense when you think about it. It was never about comfort, it was about image. Fixing the sewers wouldn't make her famous. No ambassador would write home about a great new drainage system, but a glowing portrait with 36 hand-sewn pearls? That would be remembered. That would make history. So the Queen chose beauty over practicality, perfume over pipes. This wasn't strange for her time, it was normal. Being clean wasn't really understood. Being extravagant was how you showed power. A monarch who smelled nice was elegant. A monarch who worried about plumbing was not. But the irony is clear. In trying to rise above ordinary life, Elizabeth built her court right on top of a growing problem. One that couldn't be painted over or perfumed away forever. The palace might smell like roses and spices, but underneath, something else was bubbling up. No one dared mention it too loudly, though. The Queen didn't want to hear about drains. She wanted to hear poetry. She wanted to dance in gowns so heavy they needed 3 people to lift. She wanted to smell like roses and cinnamon and never be told otherwise. And her court was happy to play along. Better to drown in perfume than risk offending the Queen by suggesting she was, quite literally, standing on a sewer. Every morning in Elizabeth's court started with a performance, before a single word was spoken. The Queen's body had to be put together, one scented layer at a time. It started with powder, not a light dusting, a thick chalky layer of white lead paint until every bit of her real skin disappeared. The paleness wasn't just about beauty, it was a statement. I am untouched. I am not like you. Then came the rouge, a bright, dangerous red made from mercury. It was dabbed on cheeks that sometimes shook from fever or toothache. Her lips were painted carefully with more colour than any flower. This wasn't makeup. This was armour. Cracks in her skin were covered with gloss. Dark circles under her eyes were hidden under powdered pearls. Even her exhaustion had to look royal. Then came the perfume, and it was never a light spray. Musk, amber, clove, orange blossom, violet, rose, all mixed in strong combinations chosen to overpower anything that might be lingering under her clothes. Perfume wasn't dabbed, it was poured, rubbed, fanned and sprayed until the room itself smelled like power. Next, the dressing. The gowns were huge, heavy with embroidery, pearls and expectation. Each one had to be laced and pinned by maids who knew not to, speak unless spoken to. Corsets were pulled tight, stiff sleeves were fastened. A giant ruff was added last, making it look like her face floated apart from her body, detached and divine. Then the gloves, soaked in scent and oil. Elizabeth wore them not just for style, but as a barrier between her skin and the world. They smelled like lavender and civet, reminding everyone who kissed her hand that they were kissing a symbol, not a woman. All of this could take 4 hours. This wasn't getting ready. This was a ceremony. She wasn't getting dressed. She was becoming herself. And if it sounds exhausting, it was. But no one was allowed to say that. No one could ask why a smart, powerful woman needed to be wrapped in lace and powder before she could talk to her advisors. Because by then, the image was more important than the person. By the time she walked out of her rooms, the Queen wasn't a tired woman with sore feet and aching gums. She was the Virgin Queen, regal, glowing, and so weighed down by clothes she could barely move without help. In her world, appearances were sacred, more sacred than comfort, sometimes more sacred than truth. Cleanliness by this point was just another ritual. Washing to get clean wasn't the goal. The goal was to look clean. Hands were wiped with perfumed cloths. Faces were blotted, not washed. Hair was powdered, never shampooed. Bathing in water was seen as a health risk, but looking oily, sweaty, or dull, that was a much bigger danger. So the court lived by the rule of the day. Smell nice, and no one will ask how long it's been since you used soap. The Queen's routine became the model. Other women trying to copy her power did the same. They painted their faces until their skin peeled. They drenched themselves in perfume. They wore dresses so wide they couldn't fit through doors without turning sideways. And they smiled through it all. Because that was the job. Not to be comfortable. Not even to be clean. But to be beautiful. Always. It's easy to laugh now. To mock a woman who needed 5 servants to help her into a corset that would later bruise her ribs. But something about it feels strangely familiar. Swap the ruffs and rouge for filters and foundation, and the difference is smaller than we'd like to admit. The tools have changed. The pressure hasn't. Maybe that's the most uncomfortable truth. Elizabeth's mornings weren't about hygiene. They were about control. In a world that wanted to reduce her to a wife or a puppet, she chose to become a spectacle instead. Her look wasn't vanity. It was power. It was a daily message. I may be a woman, but I am your queen. Act accordingly. So every morning, she stood still while her face was painted. Every morning she carried the weight of velvet and deception. Every morning, her scent drifted through the halls before she did. Her presence began with perfume. Her reign was wrapped in fabric and finished with powder. It was a masterpiece of illusion, and underneath it all there was still a body, still breath, still sweat, still human limits. But those were hidden behind layers, whispered about in private, denied in public. Cleanliness wasn't about soap and water. It was about performance. Sanitation wasn't about health. It was theatre. Every day Elizabeth stepped into the spotlight, powdered perfect, and pretended she was made of marble, and everyone around her applauded. By the time her face was powdered and her ruff was straight, Elizabeth's body didn't feel like her own anymore. It belonged to England. Not as a woman, not even as a queen in the personal sense, but as a symbol. A monument made flesh, dressed in silver lace and polished with rosewater. There was no room for imperfections, no space for a body to sweat, ache, or age. She'd become the picture of purity, control, almost divinity in human form. But being that symbol came with a cost. Her skin wasn't allowed to break out. Her breath couldn't smell sick. Her stomach couldn't growl at the wrong time. Cleanliness, or the illusion of it, wasn't just about manners. It was about national security. Because if the Virgin Queen was seen as dirty, as human, the whole illusion could crack. A stain on her gown could spread through court gossip like fire. A yellow tooth or a sweaty underarm might not sound like treason, but when your power is built on image, even a small flaw feels like a threat. Dirt in this world wasn't just physical, it was symbolic, and symbols aren't supposed to have pores. So she played her part perfectly. Perfume wasn't a preference, it was insurance. Layers of lavender, amber, and herbs weren't for pleasure. They were there to hide any human smell that might give away the truth. Under the crown was a body like any other. A body that got tired, that ached, that could, God forbid, smell. Other women at court got the message. The goal wasn't to look your best. It was to never look real. They stuffed their dresses with scented sachets. They covered blemishes with lead paint. They wiped their hands with vinegar instead of water. They learned being clean wasn't the same as being seen as clean, and being seen as clean was everything. It's hard to overstate how fragile this balance was. Elizabeth ruled alone, no husband, no children. All she had was her image and the power it gave her. A queen who ruled by herself needed more than a crown. She needed a myth, and myths don't sweat. So she polished every surface. Her speeches were careful performances. Her portraits showed an ageless mask. Even as her joints stiffened and her teeth fell out, her image stayed spotless. The same white face, the same red cheeks, the same cloud of perfume walking one step ahead of her. She kept the story alive because the story kept her on the throne. The sad part is how familiar it still feels. Even now, women's bodies are often treated more like billboards than biology. They're judged for how they look, not how they feel. Scented, smooth, smiling. Whether in royal courts or modern offices, the pressure hasn't fully gone away. The words are different, but the demand is the same. Elizabeth wasn't the only woman trapped in this performance, but she was the one who performed it best. Maybe that's why she survived. Where other rulers were brought down by war or betrayal, she was only brought down by time. Her enemies couldn't smell weakness on her, because she never let it show. To the very end, she was immaculate, or at least, she appeared to be. Behind the scenes, the work never stopped. Servants rotated her perfumed gloves. Doctors dabbed scented oils on her temples when she had headaches. She avoided strong sun that might show cracks in her makeup. The illusion wasn't effortless. It was a full-time job. But the alternative, being seen as merely human, was too risky. So Elizabeth became a body without a body, a presence without a pulse. And in doing so, she reminded everyone else that their bodies were liabilities. To be soft, sweaty, or spotted was to be less. To be vulnerable. In a court where power went to those who hid their flaws best, smelling like flowers became more than fashion. It became policy. That's why even her private moments had to be disguised. Her toilet looked like a fancy chair. The room was aired with dried herbs. Odors were covered with rose vinegar and musk. Nothing unpleasant could be linked to the Queen. Not even reality. Especially not reality. In the end, the smell around her wasn't just a scent. It was a signal, a warning, a curtain between her and the world. She smelled like a queen because she had to. Because in a time when power didn't forgive weakness, and women had to fight twice as hard to be taken seriously, a hint of body odour could undo years of diplomacy. So while her people may have loved her, they didn't know her. They knew the image, the ritual, the layers, the legend, the smell of her glove, but not the woman who wore it. Her body had become a battleground of expectations, and somewhere under the lace, beneath the powdered skin, behind the amber and rose petals, a real person sat quietly, trapped in silk and story. Elizabeth's hygiene routine wasn't about feeling good. It was about staying untouchable, and as long as the myth smelled sweet, the kingdom held together. Compared to the rest of England back then, Elizabeth was practically a cleanliness expert. While her courtiers covered mildew with musk, and the streets of London flowed with waste, the Queen had her own version of clean. It didn't involve soap and a bathtub, but for the time it was a kind of revolution in rose water and vinegar. She was careful with her linens. Underwear was changed regularly, a luxury only the rich could afford. Her handkerchiefs were perfumed and embroidered. She wiped her face and hands with cloths, soaked in rosewater or herbal vinegar. Not really to remove dirt, but to refresh the skin and leave a fragrant barrier between her and the world. The court saw this as refined. No one expected the Queen to scrub with hot water. That was for peasants. Instead, she relied on scented gloves, changed often, each pair soaked in lavender or cloves. Her face never looked oily, because it was always covered in chalky powder and pearl dust. The powder kept her dry. The powder kept her regal. The powder also clogged every pore. Bathing in water, full immersion, was seen as dangerous. Doctors said warm water opened your pores and let disease in. This sounds silly now, but everyone believed it. So Elizabeth avoided baths not because she didn't want to be clean, but because she wanted to stay alive. She did sometimes take sweating baths, steam treatments with herbs and towels, meant more to cure sickness than wash dirt off. Think of it like a royal sauna without the rinse. Her love of vinegar was practical. Vinegar with rose petals or thyme was used for everything. Wiping her face, rinsing her hands, cleaning her toilet, even dabbing her temples during headaches. The sharp smell cut through other odours and gave an illusion of purity. She smelled like vinegar and roses. Fitting, really. And yes, by Elizabeth's standards, this was clean, especially when you consider what most people were doing, or not doing. Down in the countryside, peasants shared beds with animals for warmth. Their clothes were worn until stiff. Their hands rarely touched clean water. Their breath smelled of onions and beer. Soap was rough, homemade, and mostly for laundry, not skin. Baths happened maybe once a season, not every day. Many thought water itself could make you sick. In that world, the Queen's perfumed gloves and rose-scented vinegar made her a model of royal hygiene. But let's not go too far. Clean was relative. Elizabeth's wigs were never washed. Her corsets weren't cleaned. Her heavy gowns were brushed, not rinsed. The white paint on her face was made of lead, which slowly poisoned her over the years. The important thing wasn't actual sanitation. It was the performance of it, the illusion. In a world where most people smelled like dirt, sweat and death, she managed to smell like a bottle of fancy heaven. It's tempting to romanticize this, to see her as ahead of her time. But hygiene wasn't her rebellion. It was her defense, not just against disease, but against judgment. A queen without a husband had to be more than respectable. She had to be immaculate, mythic. No odors, no stains, no weakness. Just silk, powder, and the faint smell of crushed violets. If she had done less, people would have talked. If she had smelled like the streets or like a mortal, they would have whispered. Instead, they breathed in her musk and civet and called her divine. She turned her body into an altar and her scent into a sermon. Compared to the muddy, bloody kings and queens across Europe, she seemed to float. Even her enemies noticed. Foreign ambassadors might not have liked her politics, but they talked about her presence. It arrived before she did, clinging to tapestries, lingering on chairs. The smell of the Queen became a political fact. If England was to be respected, Elizabeth had to stay untouchable, and untouchable women do not stink. It's darkly funny when you think about it. The woman who spent her life refusing to be a bride was still forced to prepare herself like one, every single day. Every morning she got her body ready for inspection. Every night she took off the layers of armour, and in between she ruled an empire while smelling like a bouquet dipped in vinegar and prayer. So yes, Elizabeth was clean. Clean enough to stand out. Clean enough to be remembered. Clean enough to survive in a world that didn't expect women in power to be clean at all. But don't confuse that for comfort. Don't mistake the smell of lavender for peace. Her cleanliness came from pressure. It was built on fear. It left no room for sweat, for breath, for mistakes. And maybe that's what makes her so fascinating. She stayed clean in the dirtiest of times, not because she loved being clean, but because she had to be. The crown didn't just sit on her head, it weighed on every inch of her body. So she bathed in perfumes, powdered her bones, and came out each day not as a woman, but as a miracle in silk. Tomorrow, like every day, she'd wake up and do it all again. Because miracles, even scented ones, need maintenance. Centuries have passed since Elizabeth last powdered her face, or dabbed rosewater behind her ears. But her hygiene, or lack of it, won't stay buried. Today, she lives on in TikToks, podcasts, and late-night comedy skits. Her bathing habits get picked apart with a mix of horror and humour, as if the modern world can't believe someone so powerful could also be, well, stinky. It's a strange kind of fame, not for winning wars or writing laws, but for famously not showering. The joke writes itself. She ruled an empire but didn't bathe. It's absurd. And yet, we're fascinated. Because in an age where we carry hand sanitizer and judge people for skipping deodorant, the idea of a queen who avoided water completely feels gross, shocking, and weirdly thrilling. We love the contradiction. How could a woman controlling armies and colonies also be someone who saw baths as a trap? How could a mind that's sharp exist under a wig that hadn't been washed in years? The Virgin Queen, untouchable, revered, leaving trails of civet and sweat behind her. It's comedy gold, it's podcast fuel, it's history that smells a little too real. But under the laughter is something deeper. Our need to make powerful people seem human, to strip away the crown, layer by scented layer, and find the body underneath. It's not really about the smell. It's about vulnerability. If even a queen couldn't keep herself fresh, maybe it's okay if our gym bags stink too. If she could rule covered in powder and musk, maybe we can survive a day without dry shampoo. But the laughter comes with unease. There's something claustrophobic about Elizabeth's rituals, something suffocating under all that lace and lavender. We see a powerful queen, yes, but we also see a woman trapped in a perfume bottle, pressed between the pages of her own myth. And maybe we recognise the scent of performance, because we still perform, don't we? We still mask our bodies. We scrub, we polish, we package ourselves for the world. We have running water and fancy soap, but the pressure to look perfect hasn't gone away. We're still afraid of being seen as messy, imperfect, or, worst of all, natural. Elizabeth didn't bathe because she feared disease. We bathe because we fear judgment. It's just a different kind of plague. So while, we laugh at her perfumed gloves and vinegar rinses, part of us envies the clarity of her routine. She knew exactly what was expected. Smell like roses, look like marble, never let them see you sweat. That rule book, twisted as it was at least consistent. Today, we chase authenticity while still using filters. We preach self-care while buying products to fix what isn't broken. Maybe her world wasn't so different after all, just with worse plumbing. And let's be honest, we love a good historical scandal, especially when it's safe. Mocking a dead queen's hygiene is easy. She can't fight back. She just stares out from her portrait, powdered and regal, while we analyse her pores from 500 years away. It's gossip dressed up as education, voyeurism with a fancy title. But every time we talk about her, on YouTube, in classrooms, on awkward dates with history nerds, we keep something alive. Not just a stereotype, but the tension between power and humanity, between myth and body, between the crown and the scalp underneath. And we remind ourselves greatness doesn't always come with good hygiene. It's weirdly comforting. Elizabeth ruled without modern dentistry, without shampoo, without soap as we know it. She stood at the centre of a global empire while her wig soaked up the sweat of ruling. And yet, she endured. She inspired. She terrified. She smelled like civet and cloves, and her name still echoes through history. So maybe the reason we can't stop talking about her isn't just because she stank. Maybe it's because she stank, and still succeeded. She proved a woman didn't need to be perfect to be powerful. She just needed to be consistent, relentlessly composed, predictably fragrant, immaculately mythic, even if it meant skipping the bath. Sure, the memes will keep coming. The jokes about lead paint and fancy toilets aren't going away. But somewhere between the laughs, a strange respect remains. Not for her hygiene, for her discipline, for her commitment to the illusion, for how she turned rosewater into armour and silence into sovereignty. And maybe centuries from now, someone will look back at our rituals, our 10-step skincare routines, our filtered selfies, our scented candles, and laugh too. They'll wonder how we endured the pressure. They'll wonder if we ever really relaxed beneath the performance. But for now, Elizabeth remains one of history's most fragrant contradictions, revered and ridiculed, admired and sniffed at. A queen who made cleanliness a legend, even if the truth was a little musty. By the end of it all, What lasted wasn't just Elizabeth's story. It was her scent. Her world was thick with it. Every hallway, every gown, every gesture carried the smell of musk and herbs and rosewater, masking not just the body, but a whole way of life. A life without clean water, without drains, without any idea of germs or real hygiene. In that world, stench wasn't a character flaw. It was the background noise of existence, and the Queen knew how to use it like an instrument. There were no showers, no bleach, no hand soap by the sink. Instead, basins of vinegar, gloves stuffed with crushed petals, wigs packed with lavender, cloaks hung by the window so the morning dew could pretend to clean them. But cleaning, like we think of it, never really happened. The idea of scrubbing dirt away with water and soap was almost laughable. Water was dangerous, feared, especially warm water, thought to open your pores and invite sickness, so they didn't wash. Not really. They masked, they maintained, and Elizabeth, she was the star of that show. She layered fragrance the way modern celebrities layer PR statements. A hint of clove on the gloves, a touch of rose behind the ears, something muskier under layers of fabric that never saw a wash tub. It wasn't subtle, but subtlety wasn't the point. Survival was. To her court, her scent was part of her identity. It trailed behind her like a royal parade. People spoke of it with awe, though none would admit they were grateful it covered the truth. The truth being, under the velvet and pearls and powdered cheeks, the Queen was a person, a human being, sweating and aching like everyone else, and sometimes smelling like it. But she understood the assignment. Queens weren't supposed to be human. They were supposed to be ideas, and ideas conveniently don't sweat. Elizabeth didn't invent this system. She inherited it. What she did was perfect it. She took the smell-obsessed expectations of her time and turned them into art. Every scented glove, every perfumed handkerchief, every herb-stuffed bodice became part of her daily armour. The stench of the palace, that sour mix of old rushes, candle grease and body odour, was the enemy she fought without ever lifting a sword. She couldn't fix the sewage. She couldn't clean the river of waste that sometimes seeped too close to the palace. But she could control how her body was seen. She could build a wall of scent so thick it felt unbreakable. Not against illness, that came anyway, but against scrutiny, against the fear that if anyone got too close they'd see her as just a woman. Not a queen, and definitely not a virgin one. The absurd part? It worked. For decades. Ministers, ambassadors, poets, suitors, all of them walked away believing the fantasy. Or at least they respected it enough to keep quiet. They marvelled at her image, her seeming youth, her energy. Even as her teeth darkened and her bones ached, the smell of decay was real. But so was her commitment to the illusion. She painted over pain. She perfumed over mortality. And history thanked her for it. If it sounds like theatre, that's because it was. The palace was a stage. Elizabeth was the lead. And every day was an act of erasing. Not her personality, but her vulnerability. She hid the flaws, the tiredness, the rot under layers of powder and perfume, and everyone played along. Not because they were fooled, but because they needed the fantasy as much as she did. A fragile court, held together by the belief that the Queen could never smell bad, could never get sick, could never die. Today we look back with horror and fascination. We study her makeup, her dental records, the lack of plumbing. We shake our heads, but part of us envies her. Not the filth, never that. Not the pain, but the power of the illusion. The ability to build an identity so strong it outlived the person. She built herself into more than a monarch. She built herself into a symbol, one that could outlast the stench of her age. Because that age was, by our standards, absolutely filthy. Streets were open sewers. Food spoiled fast. Rats were everywhere. The air was heavy with smoke. Rivers were more waste than water. Everyone stank. Everyone knew. No one could do much about it. So they did what humans do. They adapted. They added meaning to the smells. A woman who smelled of rosemary was refined. A man who stank of leather and sweat was tough. A monarch who smelled like incense and citrus was divine. That's the key to Elizabeth's legacy. She didn't deny the stink, she rose above it. She turned it into a metaphor. And in doing so, she left behind more than a throne. She left a blueprint for how to rule in an unclean world. Not by washing, but by enchanting. Not by scrubbing, but by distracting. Even her death didn't kill the perfume. The legend held. Centuries later, we still picture her powdered and perfect, glowing in candlelight, untouched by grime. Never mind the real body underneath. That part was edited out on purpose, because the truth would have smelled a little too real. So when we remember her now, let's not clean up the past. Let's remember the perfume and the plague, the incense and the infection. Let's remember that power has always depended on presentation, and sometimes all it takes to rule the room is to smell slightly better than everyone else.